First up, Menacing Nimbus. 2 mana 2/2 Shaman Elemental, Battle Cry, add a random elemental to your hands. Looks like Shaman will be making a grand return to elementals with this expansion. To that end, this card isn't anything particularly impressive. It has below average stats in exchange for a random card draw. It's worth noting that this will generally be stronger in an elemental deck, but that should be painfully obvious. Outside of that, this card is perfectly average, so fun for the arena. Also, if you low roll into a Magma Rager, at least that's still on curve. Up next, War Gear. 5 mana 5/5 mech, Magnetic. Ah, here it is, an unadulterated magnetic minion. Remember, Magnetic is like choosing between two different cards. Without using the effect, this card is below average, while using it makes this like a bigger Blessing of Kings, but just for mechs. But those comparisons aren't perfect, so let's bring in a different card. Goblins vs. Gnomes released the card Demon Heart. Bet most of you forgot that card existed. While not a direct comparison, these two cards share a lot of parallels, with the minion buffing and the mediocre second option. With that in mind, Demon Heart has never seen very much play, mostly because it's actually kind of hard to keep a demon on the field and then spend your 5 mana card on it. This card faces a similar hurdle, but at least its mediocre option is offensive rather than defensive. In the end, this card gets us sadly lacking, but getting enough mech synergies might make this card usable for Constructed. On the other hand, another card I'll be covering later probably outclasses this. Hint, 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 hint. Third, we have Upgradable Framebot, 2 mana 1/5 mech. This is surprisingly hard, guys. By itself, this card is clearly underpowered, being objectively worse than Druid of the Swarm. However, a high health minion might be more useful in a class like Priest, due to certain synergies. Additionally, everything about this card screams upgrade me, considering that its high health allows any buffs it gets to be more secure. My rating system covers individual cards and not these synergies, since any card can be made strong with synergy. This card is definitely below average, but it's also a perfect card for Inner Fire, Lady in White, and the Magnetic keyword. So in the end, I have to say sadly lacking, but with a lot of asterisks next to it. Also, rest in peace, Omgom Rager. Up next is Beryllium Nullifier, 7 mana 3/8 warrior mech, magnetic, can't be targeted by spells or hero powers. Let's start with the base minion without magnetic. It's terrible. Even considering magnetic minions buffing it further, this card is weak for its stats with little board impact. So let's consider its other form where it buffs another mech. This is actually comparable to Spike Ridge Steed, but while this card lacks taunt, it also defends from hard removal effects. In general, gifting this spell-proof effect to a minion is something that shouldn't be taken lightly, since large minions with spell-proof can be quite dangerous if there's no silence. With that in mind, this effect is better the bigger the minion, and magnetic mechs will naturally make big minions. So this card has something going for it, but that something is tied to a hard-to-play 7 mana card. In the end, it's a tough call, but I'm going to go with stupid unless it isn't. There are plenty of circumstances where this card can become quite powerful, as is the case when it comes to making a big minion immune to spell targeting. But clunkiness and a weakness to silence prevent this card from reaching excellence. Next we have Annoy-o-Module, 4 mana 2/4 Paladin mech, magnetic, divine shield, taunt. Like with all magnetic mechs, let's start by ignoring the keyword. In this case, the card is perfectly balanced. Compare-contrast with Lone Champion and Sunwalker for evidence. So the non-magnetic minion would be fun for the arena, but magnetic expands the options. Gifting Divine Shield to a minion that's about to attack makes trades easier, or makes the taunt effect more useful. This means the magnetic keyword on this card gives a small boost in strength and a medium boost in flexibility. So in the end, decent if decent. The strength of the card by itself doesn't make it a staple in non-mech decks, but Divine Shield synergies make this a valuable tool. For our last magnetic minion of the day, we have Ziliax. 5 mana 3/2 legendary mech, magnetic, divine shield, taunt, lifesteal, rush. Oh, now we're talking! Without considering the magnetic part, this card is quite unique. 3 attack on a rush minion is pretty good, and divine shield and rush are a strong combination, as are lifesteal and rush, as are divine shield and taunt. Plus, even if this card doesn't use its magnetic effect, it's still very valuable to use other magnetic minions on it. So without magnetic, I'd be willing to give this card a pretty good, just because of the sheer flexibility of its options. With magnetic, it gets better. Lifesteal and magnetic synergize together nicely, plus the rush effect means it's not necessary to have a mech on the field, just one in hand. As such, this card becomes a defensive toolbox, able to do a lot of different effects. I considered giving this card a Craft It Golden, but instead chose to reserve myself. After all, a lot of this card's strengths are dependent on synergies. Still, I don't hesitate at all to give it the rating Amazing if used right. Ziliax is definitely the best bodyguard Dr. Boom could ask for. By the way, wild players, Glinda Crowskin, Mechwarper, 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 infinite Ziliaxes. Have fun! Up next, we have Super Collider. 5 mana 1/3 warrior weapon. After you attack a minion, force it to attack one of its neighbors. This was hard to judge, given that this card is utterly unique. The two cards closest to this one are Betrayal and Misdirection, which both have significant differences. So we need to break this weapon down the old-fashioned way. When facing one minion, this card is useless, kind of like Brawl. This card's ideal is facing minions with more attack than health, that are all about medium size. In that circumstance, this card can be quite valuable. Compare and contrast with a hypothetical 1/3 poisonous weapon. While that weapon can kill one minion, this weapon could kill two, but only in select cases. However, whether or not you'll be in those cases isn't up to you, it's up to your opponent. While this card is definitely interesting and can be quite powerful, the circumstances for that power are very hard to come by, and opponents can further limit this card's strength with taunt and smart positioning. So I'm going to say this card is okay in some metas. It can be hard for it to find a home, but if it does, it will easily be the coolest card there. Time for us to move on to some Druid cards. For that, we have Landscaping. 3 mana Druid spell, summon 2/2/2 Treants. 2/2/2 Treants. 2/2/2 Treants. Who wrote this card, Peter Piper? Some of the other Druid cards synergize off of these Treants, but that's not relevant for judging this card. Compared and contrasted with Witchwood Apple, this card is slightly less flexible with the added bonus of actually being good. 4/4 stats with 3 mana card is perfect, and spreading these stats between two small bodies is about as good as keeping them in just one. So, pretty good. I can see a token druid running this card even without Treant synergies. Next up, we have Dendrologist. 2 mana 2/3 druid minion, Battlecry. If you control a Treant, discover a spell. Spells are a good thing to discover, since synergies and high power cards become fairly common. The odds of controlling a Treant are relatively high if the deck is built right, but still enough of a challenge that the card isn't easy to play. Compare and contrast Netherspite Historian. One of these cards is good to play on turn 2, the other not so much. Still, this card is decent if decent, a perfectly good card for a niche deck type. Moving on, we have Mulch Muncher. 10 mana 8/8 Druid Mech, Rush. Costs 1 less for each friendly Treant that died this game. This card is basically a giant, a high-costed minion that gets cheaper if you play it right. However, the Rush is an important detail, giving this card defensive value approximately equal to taunts. With that in mind, this card's design is fascinating for a specific reason. Treants are likely to secure the early game against an opponent, but their simplicity leaves them exposed to control decks. To that end, this card perfectly counters a control deck's stronger minions, either trading with big minions or killing medium minions easily, potentially for as little as 3, 2, or 0 mana. This makes it such that this card covers one of the weaknesses of that deck style, giving cheap control options for the late game. So this card is amazing if used right. Of course, whether or not it works is dependent on Druid getting enough strong Treant pieces to make it work. It turns out living mana will count for this as well, so I anticipate this archetype becoming relevant. Nearly done, we have Forbiddeness Floop. 4 mana 3/4 Druid Legendary. While in your hand, this is a 3/4 copy of the last minion you played. This copy will also cost 4 mana. Fascinating stuff to unpack here. There are plenty of minion effects in the game that would be exceedingly valuable to have attached to a 4-cost minion. Pretty much every card that Druids run these days would be more valuable as a 4 mana 3/4, meaning by definition, this card is better than those cards. But you need to have specifically played one of those cards right before using this one, meaning this card is actually a challenge to play correctly. Comparing and contrasting with Barnes, this card doesn't need the entire deck to service it, but it's also harder to play correctly. Though a Barnes deck could be played by a brain-dead squirrel, so that's not saying much. Altogether, amazing if used right. And considering how much synergy this currently has with Druid, I'm willing to claim that we'll be seeing a lot of this card in the future, especially in ramp decks. Penniless, you idiot! Why didn't you give it the highest rating? This card with Malygos is so broken. Oh my god, have you considered that if you let a druid draw 2 legendaries and the rest of their combo pieces, and then fail to kill them after they spend the whole turn playing a 9-drop, that maybe you deserve to lose at that point? That deck has obvious weaknesses, just like most combo decks. It's not that bad, you hypothetical crybaby. Wild Druid has the Aviana Kun combo. F***ing Aviana Kun. I think we standard players can survive Malygos Floop. But what about Hadronox? This card is clearly strong with that. We already have Witching Hour! Shut up! Finally, we have Whizbang the Wonderful. 4 mana 4/5 legendary minion, though the stats often won't be relevant. You start the game with one of Whizbang's wonderful decks. This deck is one of 18 different decks, choose from each class, and will be chosen at random. This card is amazing. Players new to the game can often use this to try out a variety of different strategies and different cards. This can help them get acquainted with different classes and different combinations, and help them plan where to build their collection next. For non-new players, this card is still fun to play casually. Getting a random deck and using it as best you can is something that any player can find fun. If you have this card and a buddy who thinks he's awesome at card games, you can have a whiz-bang exclusive series of duels where both of you have to show off talents with multiple decks. It's amazing and interesting and unique, and I love that it exists. That being said, most is stupidest. Even assuming that all these decks are tier 1, which, spoiler alert, they won't be, players play best once they become familiar with the decks they use, and the subtle strengths and weaknesses in each matchup. Whizbang prevents that practice, while also preventing players from editing their decks to adjust to the meta. To top it off, that's all assuming that the decks will be good. They won't be. The decks will almost certainly be mediocre. I will be praying to Yogg-Saron for me to open this card in my packs, because as a free-to-play user, I cannot justify spending 1600 dust on this amazing card.